Hi, this is Robert Ziekman. I'm a fourth-year neurosurgery resident at Temple University. Welcome to the ASSFN podcast. I'm here with my co-host.
Hi, I'm Danica Paulo, a fifth-year neurosurgery resident at Vanderbilt. We're happy to have you back for another episode of the ASSFN podcast. And today our topic is going to be discussing ethics of neuroscience research. And our guest speaker with us today is Dr. Nader Pouratian, who is the professor and chair of the Department of Neurological Surgery at UT Southwestern. He specializes in neurosurgeries that preserve and restore patient function, including movement disorder surgeries, surgeries for psychiatric conditions, and surgeries for peripheral nerve injuries and tumors. So thank you for being with us today, Dr. Pouratian.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Just to get started, how did you become interested in this topic, Dr. Pouratian?
So I've been involved in neuroscience research in human subjects, which are our patients, for years. My graduate work was in this area, and I've continued it as a faculty member. The longer you're in this field, I hope you step back and you start questioning what you're doing and the value of it and whether we're doing the right thing. Because as caring physicians, I think we realize and recognize that our patients are potentially vulnerable, and that there can be questions about the appropriateness or permissibility of types of research we're doing. Ultimately, I think it's extremely important work, and we gain insights that we will otherwise never be able to get to. But we need to make sure we're doing it in a appropriate and well-informed way.
Great. So we are hoping to reach a wide variety of members in our audience. And who do you think should be kind of interested and involved in this topic? And if they are interested, how can they become more informed and get more involved in neuroethics learning and discussions?
That's a great question. And I have to tell you, my answer today is different than it would have been a year ago, and definitely different than it would have been 5 years ago. In the field of ethics and other areas, we call the different groups of people stakeholders, and there are a lot of different stakeholders. As neurosurgeon scientists, we are an important stakeholder because we have access to the patients, and as the scientist part of neurosurgeon scientists, we are often running experiments. And so we are a very important group and a very important perspective because we drive a lot of the research. But we're not the most important. I'm not sure that there is a most important group. We have other clinician scientists in neurology and psychiatry that are critical partners. We have our non-clinician scientists who are partners. And I think the other group that we often, we take for granted, we assume what they're thinking are the patients themselves. So the way you get involved is, you really want to get to work with people who are already starting to think about these or who have questions about this space and ethics, and can help you learn how to conduct ethical research and start to think about this in a critical way. I think you can really latch onto, for lack of another word, any clinician scientists, ethicists, philosophers, psychologists, and make an impact in the field.
Yeah, absolutely. Definitely be relevant to a lot of fields for sure. So in your work on these topics, what are the common themes that you see kind of running through discussions? Are there any common kind of ethical points or discussions that you have discussed and kind of focused your efforts on?
A big part of the work that I've focused on is this concept of conducting non-therapeutic research in patients who are undergoing therapeutic surgeries. I think it's an interesting dichotomy because the research we're doing is not going to directly benefit them. I think many people think that it's valuable to learn about the human brain, But especially with a dual role as a clinician investigator, we need to think carefully about maintaining the integrity of the clinical space that we work in, and also protecting our patients. So I think those are two of the major themes that have really emerged from our work, but also from working with a group that's called the Research Opportunities in Humans Consortium that's from the NIH. Really, and we break it down in a paper that we wrote in Neuron about how to maintain the integrity of the clinical care, always making sure that clinical care comes first, that clinical care is not compromised for the sake of research. But also on the flip side, besides making sure that clinical care is optimized, that voluntariness of the research participants is, we have practices to promote that concept and ensure that that's the case. Just to round out the answer to your question, the other topic that comes up over and over again, which is critical, but it has multiple layers, is just this idea of informed consent. What does it mean to have informed consent? What does it mean to have done a good informed consent? What are the best methodologies? You can spend all day and your whole life talking about informed consent. It's an extremely critical area that keeps coming up.
Definitely some big topics to get into. If it's all right, if we back up for just a second to the kind of the role of the different people involved in research, the different stakeholders. Would you be able to give us kind of like a concrete example of, in your research that's conducted in the same patients that you're caring for clinically, how that kind of is played out, or if there's maybe an interesting anecdote of how you've kept the balance between clinician and researcher?
Yeah, there are many anecdotes. One that I often talk about, and I think in many ways open my eyes to the importance of asking these neuroethical questions, is really about, again, coming back to the consent process, but who should do the consent? And it started at my prior institution when we submitted an IRB application to conduct this type of research. And when we submitted the application, I said that I don't think that as the surgeon, I should be doing the consent because it's a conflict. I'm taking care of the patient. The patient may feel an obligation to me, and I don't want to put them in that position. The IRB pushed back and said, absolutely not. You are the one who has to do the consent because you are the surgeon and you are the one who understands the surgical risks of participation, and you need to be the one who's doing it. It was a long, protracted discussion. And in the end, we came up with a compromise, which was that I would introduce the study and tell them about it and tell them about the risks, but that someone else would do the actual consent so that if the patient wanted to say no, they didn't have to say it to my face, and that they could ask questions outside of the influence of me looking over their shoulder. The interesting thing is, I should say that the whole goal of that was to maintain this balance between my clinical obligations to the patient and advancing the research. The interesting thing is, we went through this whole ethical process. It turns out I had colleagues at other institutions who faced the same dilemma, this question about who should be doing the consent and how do you do the consent properly so that as to reduce this influence of the dual role of this clinician investigator, and came up with the same process. And there was a paper that came out advocating this hybrid consenting approach. And so what we saw was that multiple groups are facing these same questions and coming up with the same solutions, which is reassuring that we're all on the same path. But it also meant that there was a lot of duplicative work. And again, that was one of the incidents that made me realize, maybe we really should centralize this. We should be working on this. We should be coming up with solutions and advocating for ways to conduct these studies in a most ethical or an enhanced ethical manner. But there's lots of stories like that where I found myself asking, what's the right way of doing this? And as soon as you start asking yourself that, you know that you've got ethical questions at your hand.
Right, absolutely. I mean, one of the benefits of being a clinician is you develop that trust with the patient. But as a researcher, you don't want the patient to say, okay, I'm doing this because I trust my doctor. You really want it to be completely voluntary. So that's a great solution. So thank you for sharing that. Kind of in that same vein too, where have you seen conflicts of interest arise in conducting research? And do you have any suggestions, like the consent process that you just went through, about how those conflicts of interest can be avoided?
Conflicts of interest are really complicated, and they're much more pervasive than we think of. Um, you know, Traditionally, and in the world of medical education, we think of conflicts of interest as financial conflicts, meaning that you're getting paid by a company to be a consultant, or that you're an employee, or you have some vested interest in some research protocol. And I think we see that play out all the time, ways for people to recuse themselves. And I think those are important to think of. Um, but as groups of investigators talk, we realize that there's other conflicts. Even if we are not conflicted by a direct financial incentive through a company or through industry, there's a conflict in that, we are all, hopefully, a lot of us are funded investigators. The more research we do, the more interesting our results, especially when we're doing intracranial recordings in humans, the more likely we are to publish in high impact journals, and the more likely we are to get future NIH funding. And so there is a great push to get good data and to conduct these studies and enroll as many subjects as you can. But that could conflict with your clinical responsibilities or your clinical obligations to the patient. So that I think really is, the whole concept of competitive funding is an area that creates a conflict of interest for investigators. There's also conflicts just in the academic setting. We all want to get promoted. We all want to become an associate professor and a full professor. And how do you do that? You do that by publishing. And so there is this publish or perish mentality that creates a conflict when we do these types of research. And it's not limited to neuroscience research, but the idea that we're doing research inside people's heads and our brains help define who we are and our personality. It's a special twist and something different about this type of research and the ethical considerations and challenges.
So you had brought up one very interesting area in terms of consent. So what do you think about how the consent process and how the kind of the ethical considerations play out in terms of patients who can't give consent for themselves? I was thinking specifically of certain psychiatric applications for neuromodulation, and also for I have seen some work for diseases or disorders of consciousness.
Yeah, it's a fantastic question. So it's this idea of capacity for consent. And is there something special about it when we're talking about intracranial research or intracranial interventions for therapeutics? And I think it can be argued either way. I'll take the case example of studies of schizophrenia. There are clinical trials in patients with schizophrenia all the time. Not neuromodulation studies, but drug studies and other therapeutic interventions. And there are ways to conduct those studies in an ethical manner that has been universally accepted. Maybe not universally accepted, but that are accepted by the community. I think, as I mentioned earlier, once you go inside the head, there are some special considerations, but it doesn't mean that we need to throw out everything that we've learned or that we've applied in other settings. It's possible to conduct research in patients who don't have capacity or who may not have the full understanding that an intact patient does. But I'm going to make you think another way, which is that almost all of the patients that we have some kind of cognitive impairment. Patients with Parkinson's disease, who I often study, have executive dysfunctions. Patients with epilepsy often have cognitive impairment. So it's not as unique as we might think, or as specific as we might assume to certain psychiatric conditions. It's a really important area. And I think we've done a lot of work to try and understand patient perspectives. I think we really need to interview patients and understand what they value and what the limits are of what we should be doing and what's acceptable and what's not. Because I can tell you, because I've gone through this, what I thought patients think is completely wrong. I've learned so much from the interviews we've done in patients to understand how they see things, how they understand the consent process, how they interpret the research we do, how they value it. And I think we need to think about that actively. But it's we need to learn from what's been done in the non-neuroscience world, and then also keep talking to patients to learn what they expect and what they think is okay.
And as a similar question, what are your thoughts on neuromodulation for some of the same applications, but in the pediatric population? I think, as I had mentioned earlier before we started recording, on my pediatric rotation, with seeing some application of neuromodulation to pediatric functional disorders.
Yeah, I think the pediatric population is a special population. We have amazing success stories in neuromodulation for pediatric indications, namely dystonia. And so we shouldn't close the door on people just because they are children. We've seen this already. We know we have a history of being paternalistic and trying to protect people in a way that was probably inappropriate. And what I'm specifically referring to is, there were guidelines or guidance on deep brain stimulation for Tourette's syndrome, where it used to be that patients under the age of 25 should not be considered for deep brain stimulation. And that held true for several years, if not a decade, until it was reevaluated. And we realized that, if you still have active tics at the age of 18, the likelihood that you're going to remit and have a good quality of life by the age of 25 is extremely low. And all we're doing is being fearful and overly protective of a population that actually wants a therapy or wants an intervention. So again, I'm going to come back to, the pediatric population is a little different. I have to admit, I haven't done much ethical research in that population, but I think we need to get back to that group, talk to the patients, talk to the parents, talk to the caretakers, understand what they want, what they value, what they fear, and decide what's permissible and what's not, because that's the only way we're really going to advance the field. And it's not just those stakeholders. We need to talk to funders. We need to talk to investigators, scientists. We need to make sure that the studies that we want to do in those populations are actually unique and should be done in that population. So lots of questions to ask, but we're not going to be able to answer it without knowing some of those answers.
Right, absolutely. Those are great points. Definitely important to consider the patient's perspective, as they're so central to all of this. What are your thoughts on emerging or off-label indications for DBS, since they're less well-studied? Is it really just a good discussion with the patient and a decision with the surgeon, a mutually beneficial decision? What are things to consider there if you're kind of going off the beaten path a bit?
It's a really great question. And I'll disclose that I do off-label deep brain stimulation primarily for pain. And I don't know that I have a perfect answer for this. There's been a lot of off-label research over the past decade or 2 decades, putting electrodes all over the brain in people with different diagnoses, with the hope and with our fingers crossed that we're going to help them. And we end up learning next to nothing from them. We only hear about the small wins. We don't hear about everyone that was treated off-label who didn't have a benefit. And I think it was harmful to the field. It's definitely harmful to patients. We haven't maximized what we learned from them, and we haven't moved the field forward. I think it's really best to do as much of our treatments on protocol or and develop protocols so that we can learn from these patients, right? These patients, if you talk to them, they want to be helped, but in many cases, they want to, as much as they want to be helped, they want to know that what they're going through might help someone else in the future. And so I think if you gave an option to someone to be treated on protocol or off label, they'd probably want to be on a study so that there's some greater impact of their research or of their treatment. But that said, I think the off-label treatments are going to happen. As I said, I'm doing it. I'm trying to study it in a systematic way, but it's still off-label. There are certain off-label areas that I don't think we should go into until we have more data, and namely for psychiatric indications or for just, frankly, random ideas of what if we put an electrode here. That really shouldn't be done. I think we need to be mindful of patient safety. We need to be mindful of advancing the field and not just trying to get one additional case done.
Right. And also another point about, being involved in studies with DBS on or off label. If a patient is involved in a study and their procedure was funded by that study, but then the study ends and the patient needs a battery replacement or some kind of revision of their device, what solutions would you propose to kind of help the patients still get that therapy?
That is such a difficult question in an area that is hotly debated and contested. It's basically end of study care for patients because no one wants to take responsibility for these patients. We have patients who are really, taking a risk by participating in a study. And when we're done. And sometimes they're left out on their own. I don't know what the right answer is. I think the answer is going to end up being, frankly, I think I know what the answer is. I think the government, especially for an FDA-approved study, the government needs to, through Medicare, provide continued care for these patients. It's the only consistent entity. It's the only entity that has the depth of pocketbooks to be able to do this. I think we have an obligation to patients. We're all working together to advance the medical field. It's hard to rely on a startup company. I work with a startup company. You don't know if that startup company is going to be here in 2 years. Does that mean we shouldn't allow the study to happen? Probably not. Otherwise, we'll never make advances. Is it fair to ask an institution to take on the responsibility? Maybe, but then an institution can say, "Well, why don't you just do the study at another institution?" Everyone's going to pass the buck. I think as physicians, we're always ready to do it. I think a lot of us would willingly do it without a professional fee, but it's the devices and that cost, and someone's got to take that up. It's extremely complicated and extremely concerning. And I think the biggest concern is that if we don't come up with good answers, it's going to halt significant progress in the field.
Definitely a difficult question. Out of the interest of time, I think we were going to move on to another area that's also come up, like physiology through the devices that we have. Questions come up about ownership of the data itself, and then privacy. What are your thoughts on this area?
So data sharing and data ownership is another big area of discussion. There's a group out of Baylor that is leading a significant effort to investigate this. My disclosure here is that I'm one of the principal investigators for DABI. It's called the Data Archive for the Brain Initiative. So I'm very pro data sharing. I actually would take it to another level, which is that I think data sharing is an obligation. I think patients who participate in this research, if they're doing it to advance scientific knowledge or to advance therapeutics, they're not doing it with the understanding that it's only going to help the investigator that they are working with. I am assuming, I'd like to say I'm sure, that they would hope that whatever data they contribute would be maximally utilized to achieve the desired outcome. And that would mean sharing the data so that other people can maximize its use as well. So that's pretty easy when it comes to NIH-funded studies. It gets a bit more complicated when it's an industry-sponsored study. I'm not sure we want to go there, but I'll go there briefly. Industry invests a lot of money. They think that they should own the data, and I don't know that we can dispute that. I would hope we're a small enough field overall. The neurotechnology, especially intracranial neurotechnology field, is small enough that I hope we can get to a point that we recognize opportunities to collaborate and maximize the field in our data. But I think they've got a pretty hard lock on saying that they own that data. So maybe a two-part answer. Industry probably owns the data that they've got, but everything else really should be in the public domain and maximized.
And kind of in that same vein too, what are your thoughts on device security and people potentially hacking these devices remotely to kind of control patients' brains or devices? Is that a possibility?
So I think there's a lot of concerns about data security. I think that's going to be, everything. No matter how secure you want to make anything, it can be hacked. It is a concern. I think when I've heard discussions or participate in discussions here, the question always is, well, what if someone could get access to these signals? They can read your thoughts. But we all know that actually interpreting those brain signals and making sense of them and quote unquote reading someone's thoughts is not as simple as just stealing the data, right? It's not like stealing someone's emails. So yeah, I think there is a concern about data security. Practically speaking, at least in the near term, in the next decade or two, I doubt that anything really meaningful can be done with it. Now, could you start tracking that data to see how sick someone is or how progressive the disease is? That becomes a little bit more controversial, and perhaps there will be biomarkers for that. But I think we just need to stay on top of it. Just like with every other technology we've had to worry about hacking and security, we need to stay even more ahead of it with neurotechnology.
Dr. Pouratian, as far as privacy goes, something that seems to be interesting, especially in the neuromodulation for depression field, is that looking for biomarkers in something that's a little harder to measure than, say, a movement disorder. I've heard of trying to get data in the more natural setting or the less artificial or clinical environment. What are your thoughts on patient privacy as far as that goes?
I don't know that I have a great answer for it, except that I think we're going to see us tackling these questions very soon as we start expanding the use of brain-computer interfaces. When I started my work, when I started as a faculty member, there was literally one site that was doing brain-computer interface research, which was Brown with the BrainGate trial. Now I don't even think I can name all the places that are doing brain-computer interface work, and one of the major companies just got breakthrough device designation for it. Completely avoiding your question, but answering it in a different way. As these technologies accelerate, it's not the part we like to think about because it's so fun to think about the technology and how we're going to use it and how we're going to make people better. But integrating ethical research and ethical investigations and ethical pipelines is almost as critical, if not more critical, than the actual device and technology to try and address some of the questions that you posed to me. I don't have a direct answer for your question.
Thank you.
And lastly, with the advent of devices like Neuralink, what are your thoughts on cosmetic neuromodulation for enhancement purposes as opposed to treating an actual deficit or disease?
Really controversial. think we've all tried to avoid the concept of cosmetic neuromodulation, or we just try to avoid talking about it. I think we have to be really, really careful about it. We talk about, it's not that far-fetched to think about it. We're doing studies with brain stimulation to enhance memory, as has been done with, stimulation in the entorhinal region or in the temporal lobe. So it's not impossible to think that it's going to happen. My fear is that if we have a commercial device and we have a precedent of doing cosmetic surgery as it is, that people with means could purchase and sign up for these types of surgeries, and there's a great inequity in that type of availability of the technology. It's going to be very difficult to regulate. I think as a field, we have discouraged it and have not formally investigated. As a funder, the NIH won't fund it. But when it comes to private money or industry money, we can't 100% control them. And we'll see where it pans out. But I'm hoping that it's not something. I'm hoping that it's not something that gets popularized. But we're going to have to stay ahead of the ball, ahead of the curve.
Right. Absolutely. Maybe something that we'll be seeing later in our lifetime. Well, thank you very much for this enriching discussion and for your insights. It's been a pleasure talking with you and listening to your opinion on these very important topics.
Yeah, I would say I'll just conclude with one other thing. My own journey. I was very interested in these questions and look for partners. And I think for people who are interested, the neurosurgeons might already be working on this, but you've got to look broadly across departments and find partners. And you'll find partners in the most unusual of areas. I've found people in business schools who work on decision making. I've found partners in psychology. I've found partners in philosophy. There are people out there who want to tackle these questions with us, and it's a fun opportunity and a critical opportunity to work with a multidisciplinary collaborative team. So I think it's a wonderful area, not just a wonderful area, but a critical area for us to work in.
Yes, definitely. Completely agree with you. All right. Well, thank you again for joining us for this episode. And to our listeners, again, if you haven't followed us on Twitter already, our Twitter handle is ASSF Neurosurge. And stay tuned for our next episode. We look forward to having you back.